Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Mariia Denisova will defend the academic thesis, Co-Construction of Reliable Knowledge, Good Care and Profit-Making, the ambivalent role of private clinics in Russian healthcare. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis? And you have 15 minutes, but you know, I presume.
Highly esteemed Prorector, members of the Defense Committee, dear supervisors, friends, and family, thank you for being here with me today. In the next 15 minutes, I will present... Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you. In the next 15 minutes, I will introduce my research that I conducted over the past years that resulted in the dissertation Co-Construction of Reliable Knowledge, Good Care, and Profit-Making, the ambivalent role of private clinics in Russian healthcare. First, I would like you to imagine the following. You're walking the streets of a large Russian city, you come across different private clinics. Small clinics, such as dental and gynecology clinics, to larger hospitals that offer technologically advanced treatments. You notice that some of these clinics have billboards featuring smiling physicians that promise to bring professional, ethical, and evidence-based care. You start wondering, what does the term evidence-based medicine mean? Or simply EBM. Curious, you step into a bookstore and quickly find a recently published book on EBM written by a physician employed at a private clinic. The author claims that popular medications that you and your family use are mere placebos and urges to stop using them immediately. You decide to search the term EBM online. The top results bring up a news article featuring yet again physicians from private clinics. These clinics promise to follow EBM principles and thus bring better medical care to patients in Russia. Their websites and social media are filled with advice on choosing ethical doctors, warning about antibiotics misuse, and references to international clinical guidelines. You might ask yourself, what do these clinics promote exactly? Is evidence-based medicine a mere marketing slogan, or does it really signal innovation medical care? After all, can good care and commerce be compatible? This question signals a feeling of ambivalence, which is not unique to Russia. Historically, EBM comes from the West, where at the time there was a growing concern about the physicians treating the same medical conditions very differently, but also about increasing influence of pharmaceutical industries in the healthcare systems. The proponents of EBM at the time, mainly epidemiologists and clinicians, strongly believed that medical decisions should not solely rely on doctors' personal judgment, which can be in turn influenced by the pharmaceutical industry and their interests. Instead, they argued that the decision should follow standardized clinical guidelines based on solid evidence, such as the results of randomized controlled trials. So the ideal behind of EBM, as we know it today, relies on three main pillars: scientific evidence, clinical judgment, such as the opinion and expertise of a doctor, and the values and preferences of a patient. While all three elements are equally important, it's scientific evidence, especially the one derived from randomized controlled trials, that is being prioritized in clinical decision-making and governing healthcare systems. This evidence is also brought up to medical professionals by the guidelines and medical recommendations that we usually call standards. In Russian healthcare system and medicine do not stand far away from these principles, but the configuration of medical standards and their production is different from those in the West. Existing medical standards in Russia are developed solely by the Ministry of Health and are mandatory to fulfill. Unlike standards produced in many Western countries, they are created without clear involvement of medical professionals and their local associations. The standards are sometimes based on Western clinical guidelines, but the procedures behind the production of the standards remains black boxed. And the standards are often criticized for being outdated and detached from real clinical practice. It's worth noting that while Russian healthcare has universal healthcare coverage through the state insurance program, it is clear that many healthcare services in the country are being significantly delayed or also completely unavailable to patients, especially those of outside medical hubs. To fill the gaps, public hospitals in the country also offer paid services. Against this background, fully private clinics have become an attractive alternative for those who can afford it. Compared to public hospitals, private clinics generally have more resources and organizational independence to implement new medical care practices. Thus, it is not so surprising that some private clinics got to proclaim to follow evidence-based medicine and hence better quality care. For example, some of these clinics claim to follow international clinical recommendations, such as the one produced by the WHO, and not Russian medical standards. So in my research, I decided to study these private clinics to understand how they practice and negotiate the ideas of reliable knowledge, good care, and profit-making. I was interested whether these ideals and principles can be compatible and if they need any trade-offs. I was also interested in what ambivalences and compromises emerge in this process. To answer these questions, I conducted ethnographic research between 2001 and 2023 in 3 private clinics in 2 large Russian cities. I interviewed their doctors, managers, professionals they partnered with, and patients. These 3 clinics had different organizational structures and provided different types of medical services. All of these clinics were offering oncology services, which later became an important part of my research. These clinics were primarily focused on middle and upper middle class clientele, but at the same time, 2 of them provided a few services free of charge under the compulsory state insurance program, so-called CMI. In my research, I demonstrated that private clinics are inherently ambivalent actors. While trying to innovate medical care, they simultaneously pursue their profit-driven interests. But instead of treating quality care and commerce as incompatible or 2 opposing goals, I showed that the 2 can co-create each other. First of all, when appealing to EBM, private clinics aim to distinguish their medical practices as superior to practices in other healthcare organizations, both private and public. For example, they claim to use international clinical guidelines, which they perceive to be of better quality care compared to Russian medical standards. And this preference was rooted in a deep mistrust towards the Russian Ministry of Health and the way it produces medical information. My participants also questioned the procedure involved in producing clinical evidence in Russia more generally. In contrast, they saw clinical trials and guidelines produced in the West as superior and linked the research behind them as with honest science, transparent, strictly monitored, and independent from the will of the state. Furthermore, private clinics treated IBM as an ethical principle. In Russia, private clinics in general are infamous for overprescribing treatments and medications with no proven efficacy for patients just to earn more profits. Private clinics I studied try to distinguish themselves from those other greedy private clinics. They appeal to IBM as a tool guaranteeing only high quality and needed care. By claiming to abstain from overprescriptions, clinics downplay their commercial motives and portray themselves as honest business. In practice, however, private clinics often had to compromise the standards of reliable knowledge. They had to carefully balance between using international clinical guidelines and complying with Russian medical standards. For example, when clinics participated in the state insurance program called CMI to offer medical services for free to some of their patients, they had no choice but to strictly follow Russian medical standards to be eligible for reimbursement for the services they provide. Some physicians also admitted compromising their ideals of good care. Sometimes they would prescribe medications which they would deem ineffective to gain trust from patients, for example, those patients who go to particular treatment in other public hospitals, and also make these patients to trust their expertise and to adhere to the treatment that they deem evidence-based. To justify these deviations, physicians explained that good care is not limited by simply following the guidelines, but should be pragmatic and account for patient needs. They emphasized that practicing good care is impossible without active patient involvement and decision-making. To apply the medical knowledge they trusted and stay afloat as a business, private clinics relied on a wide range of informal practices. For example, they would write prescriptions that followed official medical standards, but then explain to patients orally how to adjust these treatments based on international guidelines. Others would extra recommendations on top of the official treatment plan, referring again to international clinical guidelines. In other times, clinics also use their internal research departments and councils of doctors to justify these choices on paper. In a healthcare system full of conflicting rules, and where corruption in the public sector is common, informal practices were also necessary to make formal regulations work in practice. For example, while private clinics are legally allowed to join the CMI program, in reality, this rarely happened without behind-the-scenes negotiations and informal connections. Building and maintaining informal networks was key for private clinics to survive in the challenging healthcare landscape. While informal practices are often perceived as solely corruptive or subversive, my research has shown that they also serve as a mechanism of generating valuable knowledge to navigate and survive a risky and non-transparent healthcare environment. Finally, private clinics were closely connected to public healthcare system. By focusing specifically on cancer care services these clinics offered, I show how they simultaneously filled in the gaps in the public healthcare system, but also benefited from its malfunction. To demonstrate the complexity of these private-public interrelations, I use the metaphor of the swamp, which you can see here on the slide. My research participants described public cancer care system in Russia as treacherous to navigate. Patients are often unaware of the formal regulations in place, what care they are entitled to, and how their medical journey would proceed. For example, in the stage of diagnosis, patients can lose time by failing to coordinate the required diagnostic tests and medical appointments, ended up repeating them over and over again. As a result, they end up in the loop of diagnosis, as you can see in the slide. Furthermore, patients can also receive contradicting medical advice from different professionals from different hospitals they travel to, which can confuse them even more. And it also wastes their valuable time as they try to sort it all out. All of this increases their uncertainty about how to proceed, what their diagnosis is, and what their treatment plan is exactly. Patients can also receive inadequate treatment due to a lack of communication and coordination within and between public hospitals. This is not due to the neglect of doctors, but because of this over-bureaucratization of healthcare and overburden of professionals who don't have enough and sufficient time to communicate with patients their treatment plans. Another issue that arose in my research was medicine shortages, especially in hospitals outside of larger medical hubs, where patients ended up treated with medications and receiving therapies that are available but not necessarily fit their personalized needs. In this disoriented system, patients often get lost, disappear, or can give up on treatment altogether. They're quite literally being swamped by the malfunctioning infrastructure of public cancer care. My research participants describe public cancer infrastructure in Russia as treacherous to navigate. And the private clinics who were functioning in this system were helping patients to navigate it. Using their informal connections of professionals in other hospitals and clinics, they were able to build routes in this swamp infrastructure for patients to connect different parts of the treatment. They also provided patients with a second opinion on conflicting diagnosis or just complicated cases, and they were also preparing patients for treatment at hospitals, for example, by speeding up their diagnostic process. At the same time, the clinics directly profited from the swampy state of public healthcare. They turned their informal knowledge about how the system really works in practice into commercial service, available almost exclusively to middle-class urban patients. Their role in public healthcare system was highly ambivalent. Overall, my research shows that private clinics play an ambivalent role in Russian healthcare. This ambivalence is evident in how they balance trusted medical knowledge with the need to make a profit, survive as a business, and interact with the public healthcare system. By studying these private clinics, I also showed opportunities and challenges Russian healthcare organizations and medical professionals face today. Compared to public institutions, private clinics are more opaque and less legible for state control. This relative invisibility, coupled with ambition and organizational resources, has made them spaces where new medical practices can emerge. Practices that would be much harder to implement in the tightly controlled public healthcare setting. These innovations, nevertheless, are fragile. They require substantial resources and organizational security to sustain. Without actively engaging medical professionals and their associations in the production of medical knowledge and standards in Russia, achieving better and more equitable care is hardly possible. Thank you for your attention, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for the very clear presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Groot. He was the chair of the assessment committee and he's a professor in health economics at Maastricht University. Professor Groot.
Thank you, Mrs. Prorector. Dear candidate, I've read your work with great interest. I think you have made an important contribution to our knowledge on the role of private clinics in Russia in particular, but I think with a wider application to other post-Soviet countries that haven't reformed their healthcare system so much as well. I want to congratulate you with that, and I want to extend my congratulations to your supervisors for that as well. When reading your dissertation, my impression was you very much focus on the role of healthcare providers, of the private clinics and so on. But do you pay fairly little attention to what this emergence of private clinics have meant for patients? In some sense, I think in many post-Soviet countries, including in Russia, the healthcare delivery was a completely a free market, where in the public sector people had to pay informally or have connections to receive a good treatment, and also I think to navigate through the system. In the private sector, these informal payments are more or less only formalized. That raises the question: what actually, the effects have been, or what has meant for patients that these private clinics have entered the market? That's my first question. My second question is: the post-Soviet countries, including Russia, or more like the Soviet Union, was characterized by a lack of civil society and lack of civil society organizations that you also mentioned in your presentation, where you see that treatment guidelines are made by the Minister of Health and not by professional organizations themselves. That also, I think, holds for external governance in the system. The inspectorate that assesses quality of care delivered. So I also want to ask you to reflect a bit on the role of these external governance mechanisms in the private sector in Russia.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your questions. I will start with the first one, and I would like to take a step back and guide us briefly through the process of transformations in the 90s and 2000s that you referred as post-Soviet. So indeed, as you rightly highlighted, in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the private healthcare was completely privatized, and public hospitals dealt with huge medicines and just equipment shortages to an extent where there were no available cotton or syringes available in many hospitals. At the same time, public professionals were working underpaid, so that was indeed a very difficult process, which then forced public hospitals to informally provide some services, some paid services as well. So in that sense, indeed, there was not much, I guess, of a difference between public healthcare and private, as we usually draw these boundaries within. But indeed, these boundaries were completely conflated. And at the same time, we also observed the emergence of completely privately owned, for-profit private organizations that provided only paid healthcare services. At the same time, their role in Russian healthcare system in the 90s and 2000s was very small, because these were usually small clinics that were owned by professionals with high status, very also prominent in the field, that also work in public hospitals. They would open their small private clinics or offer private consultations. At the same time, when we look at the Russian healthcare system today, we can observe drastic differences. So I should acknowledge that the role of informal payments and public hospitals decreased, while at the same time the number of private clinics increased dramatically. They now offer around different healthcare services, also including technologically advanced treatments. So I think when we talk about Russian healthcare as post-Soviet, there is a really drastic difference of how it functioned in the 90s and 2000s and how it looks today, how it functions today. And indeed, we see the greater role of the market forces there, which I was really curious to explore. And what I found in these private clinics that claim to follow this evidence-based medicine is that often they were founded or indeed founded by professionals who believed that the quality of care in the country needs to be improved. And by articulating these principles of evidence-based medicine, they were criticizing the top-down approach to patients' relations, for example, that is really prominent in was really prominent in the Soviet healthcare system. So they were criticizing the authoritative role that clinicians usually tend to take when treating patients. They were also criticizing the quality of medical standards that exist, and thus offering patients treatment options that were based on international clinical guidelines.
Maybe if we go back a bit to what it has meant for patients, I mean, with scarcity also in the Soviet times, there was always of course, created inequalities, and that was mainly based on your position and also the people you knew. If you had contacts with physicians, access was easier, and you get better treatment as well. Now, with the emergence of informal payment in the public sector and also private clinics, that has been more monetarized, you can say. So that created other inequalities between those who had the money to pay for it and those who didn't. Also, I think what you have seen in the beginning is basically that these private clinics piggybacked on the public facilities as well. So what in your opinion has that meant overall? Has it been an improvement for patients, these private clinics, or rather the opposite?
Mm-hmm. I think in my research, I approached the treatment and care these clinics provided with some feeling of ambivalence. So on the one hand, I can highlight that by what I observed in the interviews and by the practices of that clinics conduct, that they indeed try to change certain medical practices in healthcare, but being more attentive to patient needs, but trying to incorporate their preferences as well. What uniquely they do, they also quite aware of these inequalities in the healthcare system. So some of these clinics, especially small oncology clinic, was trying to enlarge their clientele by also focusing on kind of working class patients as well, by offering them, for example, speeding up diagnosis process, and then they can go to public hospitals and receive this care. So professionals I interviewed were well aware of these inequalities, I should say. They were also aware that patients that got used to, especially middle-class patients that got used to go into different private clinics, but also public hospitals and pay there, were expecting different attitude towards them. They were expecting different service, they were expecting different attention being paid to them in comparison to how patients were commonly treated in the Soviet Union or are still commonly treated.
In view of the time, maybe we can move to the second part of my question, the role of external governance, also in the private clinics.
Yeah. So in my interviews, whenever I asked my interviewees about the quality of care and how they perceive it and what kind of regulations they need to comply, they would always often refer to them being quite invisible for many state authorities, which is the case for many private clinics in Russia, because they're not being thoroughly checked by these external government authorities that you're referring to, for example, such as insurance companies that do indeed check the compliance of healthcare organizations strictly with the medical standards. But because they were not almost always participating in the state insurance.
That would also have been my expectations. That raises my final question: where does evidence-based medicine come from? I mean, you do as if it is originating from physicians themselves. But my impression is that many of the older physicians hardly know about evidence-based medicine, let alone that they want to practice it. So why this? Where does it come from? If also this external governance that may enforce it is virtually absent?
That's an excellent question, and I think this was exactly what I was trying to research. I was not trying to impose an already pre-given definition of evidence-based medicine as we know it today on my interviews, but I'd rather interested in the interpretations of it. And what I learned was that they used EBM as a strategic rhetorical tool to distinguish themselves from, on the one hand, public hospitals that offer this care that relies on these outdated standards that produced in Russia and not up to date, as they would call it. On the other hand, they were really trying to differentiate themselves in the market, because the market is really filled with clinics that provide questionable care and receive lots of critiques from the public as well. So they also use EBM as a tool to redefine their professional authority.
Okay.
Yeah.
In view of the time, I think we have to, I see the pro-rectors getting nervous. So I'll give the word back to the pro-rector. Thank you for this discussion.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Ball. He was a member of the assessment committee, and he is a professor in healthcare governance at Rotterdam. And thank you for being here, Professor Ball.
It's a pleasure, dear Rector. Dear candidate, congratulations also with your thesis and your wonderful presentation. I really like the swamp. You know, it's a very nice metaphor. It's also a very nice picture. And I really enjoyed reading your thesis also. I didn't know much about Russian healthcare, just a little, but I learned a lot, so that was great. Of course, I also have a couple of questions. And to start off, I was going to follow up on the question actually that my neighbor just asked about EBM. And I was wondering a little bit, because the way that you describe evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine right now in your thesis is mainly Russian doctors looking at Western science. So they read the Lancet, they read the New England Journal, they might even read the British Medical Journal, you know, or oncology journals or whatever. And that seems a rather sort of flat definition of what EBM is, because I think in the West it's a much broader system of doing research, of teaching, of, you know, this whole university was once based on evidence-based medicine with the idea of problem-based learning and those kinds of things, which came out of that movement. And also guidelines are of course part of that, you know, because it's part of distributing the knowledge that is then also. But the teaching and research are really important in EBM because they create reflexive minds, right? So that's the idea, that you have to be always critical about what you're doing, that you always have to question everything, not only of yourself, but also of your colleagues and your patients and whatever. And so I was really, and I just looked at the people that you've been interviewing, and some of them were research department leads or researchers, and so I thought, but I don't see that so much in your thesis. So can you describe a little bit, just for me, you know, not being knowledgeable at all with the Russian system, how research is sort of used by these clinics to further their course of EBM?
Mm-hmm. Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. Indeed, as you correctly highlighted, my informants provided sometimes simplified definition of EBM, and this is how our conversations will usually start. But, and I would notice that they found it very important to justify for me the differences from other healthcare organizations in Russia. And their justification was indeed commonly based by referral to these foreign journals or international medical associations that produce international guidelines. So they were really trying to justify to me that they are different and that they're knowledgeable as well of this kind of larger knowledge arena. But upon closer examinations, they would always be critical about, for example, the educational system in Russia. Actually, some of my interviewees were founders of educational programs for medical students in Russia to teach them skills which they called critical thinking. They were teaching them how to, first of all, search for these international guidelines, and then how to deviate from them. So they found it very important, the role of critical thinking and open communication, because they would often refer to Russian educational, medical educational system as the one that is based on very strict professional hierarchies of status, where basically the experience of a physician who is teaching student defines their evidence and the procedures that they should follow. So they were really arguing for evidence-based medicine as a tool of democratizing these relations in the healthcare system, including the ones in the educations. They were also referring to the role of professional associations that is so profound in the West, as they would call it, and completely or almost completely absent in Russian healthcare, and many of them would be involved in actively building these professional communities that would share the same ideas of evidence-based knowledge and evidence-based ways of thinking as well. So they deemed it really important to build this epistemic knowledge community or knowledge communities that would share these ideals and also exchange this knowledge. Because also, for example, I would highlight this here because I think it's very important. The private clinics I studied and their management spent lots of money to allow their professionals to use systems such as UpToDate for them to be able to browse these clinical guidelines, because otherwise it's really expensive to access these systems. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You know, I'd like to hear much more about that, and we should talk about it further. But I have one other thing that I want to discuss with you, and that is the role of informality. Because I like that also very much part of your thesis, so the coexistence of formal and informal systems, which I think we all know already, you know, from Russian and post-Soviet countries, but we also know from Western countries. So the kind of studies that I engage in, we always meet this, you know, informal practices necessary to keep formal practices running, right? So the whole repair work, workaround, all that kind of stuff that was in the, well, in medical sociology for a very long time already. And there's two questions I have with that, but they are combined. So one is, no, let me phrase it a little differently. So you can do informality in many different ways. And we also, and you describe that also in Russia, that there's a lot of corruption, which is a different kind of informal practice than the one that you are looking at. And I was wondering, so how can we learn from your doctors and private clinics how to do informality in a good way? How do they sort of manage to, be outside of the system, having these informal practices, while sort of, doing good for their patients and not becoming corrupt? And it's just, and ethics is not enough. There should be more than that. Yeah.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I would completely agree with you, and I would highlight that my research participants really articulated this informality a lot, and also they articulated the efforts they put into adhering to the standards of good care or ideals of good care that they proclaimed. So, and they did it in different ways. And I would like to bring an example that for me was rather striking of a large multi-specialty clinic that I studied, which was also an old clinic as well-established clinic that recently undergone dramatic changes in regards to introducing evidence-based medicine principles. So what these clinics did, and they established the research department that was responsible for doctors being more, for example, attentive to patient needs, being more careful in how they balance between medical standards in Russia and compliance with clinical guidelines that the research department was responsible to disseminate between the doctors. So throughout this process of changes, they hired over 30% of their personnel because they were not according to my participants, they were not willing to comply with these new ideas of evidence-based.
And how did they know?
They simply told them. So the medical...
No, but how did they know that these doctors weren't complying with the...
These doctors were very vocally opposed to the changes happening in the clinic. So for them, there was a really huge confrontation between the new management and the staff of the clinic, so at least some, who didn't want to, at least according to the managers and professionals I talked to, didn't want to change these practices and be committed to kind of new ideals of care, which I think for the private clinic in Russia or any healthcare organization in Russia is a huge loss, because it's really hard, as we know, in all healthcare systems to find medical staff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in answer to the question of my neighbor, they set up a sort of internal governance system to control quality okay, I have to stop, but I would be curious to know much more about this because I think we can learn a lot from it.
Discussion is very interesting. You have to move forward. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Borozdina. Her expertise is sociology and health at Tampere University, Faculty of Social Sciences in Finland. And a special welcome to you, because you come from Finland and you made a trip to Maastricht. The floor is to you.
Thank you. I'm very glad that I'm able to participate in this event. Dear candidate, thank you for your great work and congratulations with nicely addressing this challenging topic full of ambivalences, and for a great job in conducting fieldwork in challenging circumstances. But of course I have questions. One of them is related to this intersection of organizations and professionals, because in your work and in your presentation, you speak both about private clinics and about professionals, and sometimes you speak about them kind of interchangeably. So you speak about how they co-construct reliable knowledge, good care, and profit-making kind of together. But as you have just mentioned, that clinic is able to fire professionals, like half of its staff, so it's not the same thing. And also professionals, obviously, they have like their different, system of professional governance, professional associations, and organization has its own reasoning. So I would like you to probably differentiate a bit more between these two. How do you address differences between them in their pursuit for reliable knowledge and good care? And also probably to focus a bit more on professionals and how professionals and professionalism is changing in Russia, in the context of the dynamic which you described, because maybe professionals are becoming more agentic because they have to navigate this volatile environment all the time, or maybe their authority increases because they use evidence-based medicine, or maybe it decreases because they lack this authority of unique experience-based experts. So, yes.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your questions. In my research, indeed, I treated private clinics as my primary unit of analysis. But as you rightly highlighted, there are perhaps differences between how organizations would justify in kind of public arena their practices and their ideals of EBM versus how professionals work in these organizations would do that. And indeed, I had these conversations with some of the professionals working in these clinics once, saying that in their daily life they would never describe themselves as evidence-based oriented professional because they would articulate it differently. They would articulate it by appealing to good quality care. They would articulate it by appealing to patient involvement and patient-centered care, but not necessarily evidence-based medicine. At the same time, they would also highlight that this is important for them to be able to distinguish themselves on the market. So they were well aware of this kind of double rationale of EBM. But if I look at the professionals working in private clinics that I interviewed, indeed, what they highlighted in their interviews is also their commitment to their organizations as well, and to their colleagues as well. Especially in small clinics that I interviewed, I found rather strong feeling of community that these professionals articulated. For them, working in these clinics was also working, collaborating with their colleagues, and they valued this a lot. They also valued the opportunities these clinics provided them in terms of continuous professional development, because managers of these clinics were interested in also incentivizing their employees to participate in academic conferences or even conduct their own research in the clinic. They valued it greatly, and therefore the kind of interests of the clinics and professionals were similar. They will also, as you mentioned, express greater feeling of professional agency that they could exercise because they knew that their expertise is trusted, especially in those in smaller clinics, and that they could rely on clinical guidelines to justify their decisions and deviation from medical standards. Sometimes when they had doubts, they were also very in a way grateful that they were able to express these doubts to their colleagues and to the management and have the space to discuss. At the same time, there were sometimes some of these professionals were also employed at public hospitals because they still believe that the expertise and knowledge that they're generating in these private clinics should go outside of the confinements of private clinics. So they also try to bring their expertise and also gain more in public healthcare setting. So indeed, I think if I could summarize it, I think professionals that I interviewed were very committed to these ideals of good patient-oriented care that they had, and they really valued this ability to think critically, to express their opinions or their doubts, and being able to invest in their professional development.
Thank you. I have a second question. If you could answer probably briefly about the context, because you very much emphasized that your research is context sensitive and EBM is differently implemented in different contexts. To what type of contexts your research is generalizable? Like, is it instructive for contexts which have undergone rapid transformation and rapid neoliberal reforms, or for post-Soviet context, or for non-democratic context, or some other type of context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think when I was writing my thesis, I was also thinking about what kind of analytical toolkit I can offer for scholars or perhaps professionals working in another healthcare environment. And what I was thinking about that we can think of introduction of EBM in Russian healthcare setting as introduction of perhaps other digital technologies in many healthcare systems, such as, for example, AI that we see a lot of happen in the healthcare systems. So what is interesting when these new novelties happen in the healthcare system, that it also shifts also agency and responsibility of different professionals. For example, in the multi-specialty clinic that I researched, we saw the emergence of a completely new department, such as research department, which is something I would say rather new to any organizations in Russia, to have such department in a clinic that would be responsible for dissemination of the standards, and then also have more to say in the process of treatment, right? And they are the ones assessing quality treatment as well. What I was also arguing for is that the situated character of evidence-based medicine and also the ideals of good care, and to know what evidence-based medicine is actually an empirical question. Furthermore, upon researching further into private-public interrelations that I observed, I started to think that perhaps the boundary, the clear-cut dichotomy between the private and public healthcare provision in practice does not often stand. And then we can observe it in so many other healthcare systems, including Western ones, for example, the UK system that is also really struggling with this, is how private-public are interconnecting, again, in these daily practices, because then we can really see how these interrelations together shapes the provision of care. So, indeed, and then once again, as was highlighted, informal practices that were an important part of my research, I really wanted to show how whenever we introduce these new changes, informal practices will emerge almost naturally, because by design, any technology is not perfect. We cannot always predict how it's going to be implemented and exercised. And here comes all these informal practices that, or invisible practices that then are needed to make this basically work in practice. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Chabanovska. She was a member of the Assessment Committee and she is a professor in Public Health, Leadership and Workforce Development at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I really read with pleasure your work, which is impressive, intellectually stimulating. Congratulations, and congratulations to your supervisory team. There are several questions that I have in mind, and first of all, I was very intrigued by the metaphor that you are using of this swampy landscape, especially in relation to cancer care. And I'm interested how this metaphor shaped your analytical lens, and what are the limitations of this metaphor, and what are the strengths, especially when we think about the relationships between the private and public sector.
Mm-hmm. Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your questions. So I treated the swamp metaphor as my analytical tool to explore the private-public interrelations and ambivalences that emerge there. And the metaphor of the swamp indeed came to me throughout the process of interviews, because from their early stage I realized that every time my participants would refer to their cancer care services, they would always tell that this is uncertain or ambiguous. And once I would try to ask them, could you delineate it for me? Could you clarify where exactly this uncertainty comes? They wouldn't be able to do that because the whole system was malfunctioning. It's not that every part is wrong, but the way how these obstacles pile up together, making patients basically drown. Mm-hmm. So I think the strength of this metaphor included this ability to also visualize the journey that patients go through, and to see how there are this kind of smaller islands of hard infrastructure that is there. Hospitals are there, free healthcare on paper is there, right? The treatment plans are there, but patients do not necessarily manage to go through one stage or level of treatment to another. They always disappear in between. So like in the swamp, if you don't have a guide, you will drown in the swamp. But once you know where to walk, which routes are more, let's say, firm and stable, then the patients were able to actually navigate and get to the point of their cancer treatment. And private clinics were these guides on the swamp that were telling patients which route to take in order not to be drowned. The limitations of this metaphor perhaps is that my research did not include enough interviews, to my opinion, with patients. And this was justified with also the situation of my research. On the one hand, I really wanted to focus how professionals themselves navigate in the system. On the other hand, I didn't want to impose any risks to cancer patients during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, and I will continue with additional question, maybe building on what you just have said about the patients and how you wanted to care for the sensitivity. It is a qualitative research, and it is of great interest how you manage to assure credibility and trustworthiness of the results, especially when navigating through this sensitive and vulnerable landscape concerning the system itself and the patients and the personnel.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question. I think this is indeed of crucial importance. For me, the trustworthiness of my research or the care and ideas about it came already from the moment when I was sampling my research participants. For me, it was important to have different private clinics to see this variety of practices involved and to see whether there are the similarities that I observed and how they articulate these relations with public health care, but also to the quality of care. Furthermore, the triangulation, of course, was important. Therefore, I also did analysis of the digital sources. I also observed the recordings of online conferences where different professionals outside of the private clinics I explored were involved. Also, triangulations of sources that I used, and I was privileged enough to also work alongside with a colleague of mine who was studying patients' organizations in Russia and how patients also struggle with the healthcare issues, so we could always communicate and try to understand whether we see this picture similarly. So I think working in a team on the stages of conducting research and analyzing that data was very important. And finally, I always communicated my analysis and my findings with my research participants back to have their feedback on how they themselves view what I say. And for me, that was really, really valuable. And I'm very grateful for also their openness to think along with me as they did, for example, with the swamp.
Thank you very much. Do I have time for one more question?
Yes,
all right.
sure.
So, okay. So the last question is related to transferability of your results. And how have you assured that these results can be transferable to other contexts in the countries which are post-Soviet? In what can be the implications for healthcare professionals in those countries that they can build on from your study?
Yeah, I think the story that I was telling in my thesis is, of course, localized, but it doesn't mean that we cannot build these connections to other healthcare contexts, perhaps post-Soviet, but I would also argue for other healthcare systems that struggle with medical shortages or also experience the influx of privatization. So, and here I would like to come back to this idea of ambivalence, because what I observed that in the context of struggling healthcare systems, but also in the context that are authoritarian or leaning towards authoritarian regimes, is that it's really difficult for professionals to implement any changes in medical care. And so private clinics perhaps become this secured spaces where professionals can articulate their ideals and try something new and see and experiment in a way. So in a way, private clinics, while remaining private business, also become this almost laboratories for experimentation, for like in a hopefully good way. And I think this is a valuable insight to consider for struggling healthcare systems. Yeah, and indeed, I believe that my research findings can also speak to healthcare systems that for example, undergo huge transformations, for example, in regards to the implementation of new technologies or knowledge ideals.
Thank you very much. I give a voice back to the prorector.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Lang. She's the last opponent, and her expertise is anthropology and health, and she works at Maastricht University. Dr. Lang.
Thank you, Pro-Rector and dear candidate. First, I also wanted to congratulate you. I was really impressed by how you weave together privatization, improvisation, and knowledge in private clinics in Russia, and also show us very skillfully what it means to navigate a complex system in in a post-socialist society. And I also want to congratulate to your own improvisation, how you adapted and improvised with your research methods in the challenges of pandemic and war situations. So that was really also something that I found very impressive. I have two questions. Maybe I start with the first one. So one of your argument is that in the 3 private clinics where you worked, profit-making does not really contradict EBM-oriented care, but instead that both are closely interlinked. You write that EBM is constitutive of medical care at private clinics, and private clinics are actually the one place where EBM can truly be practiced. Moreover, you write that the practice of EBM is closely linked to doctors' informal knowledge work. So, for example, they used forums that condense new findings for swift retrieval, and also that they use social media to discuss EBM and good care, working around state control. So my question really relates to the everyday practice of all this. So how do physicians try to keep up with new research findings, especially since one of the key challenges in their work is the busy schedule they find themselves in, and how do they find time to read and also to engage with these kinds of knowledge work in the midst of all of this? And what does it mean then in regard to the distinction that you made so clearly between evidence-based and experience-based? So is the kind of care that doctors engage with not also based on experience in some way? And what does it mean for this clear distinction between evidence and experience?
Mm-hmm. Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your questions. Perhaps I will start with the latter one. So the way my participants distinguish between experience-based decision-making and clinical-based is that for them it was important to draw the boundaries between good and bad medical care in terms of guidelines and standards we use. So when they wanted to draw a boundary between knowledge produced in Russia and criticize the procedures involved versus knowledge produced elsewhere, usually on the West, they would appeal to the importance of really following and adhering to clinical guidelines. And in situations when your personal opinion, for example, would contradict these guidelines, you should probably stick to the guideline. And however, once they wanted to articulate their own expertise and the attention to patient needs that they pay, they would switch to the importance of experience-based knowledge used in their treatment. For example, they would say that it's really important for professionals to be critical and be able to judge based on the patient preferences, but also on the experience, how they can deviate for the standard or the guideline if they know that the situation requires so. Then when I ask, how do you know when the situation requires so, then they will indeed bring this idea of them being part of the community, part of the professional community that share particular knowledge ideals, such as EBM, where they were able to discuss these cases, discuss this maybe deviations from these clinical guidelines, also foreign clinical guidelines, not only Russian medical standards, and also have this ability to voice their doubts and then to discuss them in a more kind of collegial atmosphere. So in these everyday practices, indeed, they spend quite some time discussing their medical practices and also knowledge they generate within the clinic and outside of the clinic. Most of the professionals I interviewed had their blogs, social media blogs. They would, for example, share the articles they read and disseminate this knowledge. They would also hold workshops, and some of them were participating in additional educational programs for young healthcare professionals who would be interested, for example, in reading medical statistics, because they believe not every doctor understands how to read even these guidelines or understand how randomized controlled trials work. So they spend lots of time kind of communicating with doctors out there.
Yeah, thank you for this response. And maybe to continue on this, you also write that the physicians you talk to think about EBM, about an equivalence to the democratization of knowledge and decision making, and I fully agree. However, I was wondering, like producing knowledge in EBM through randomized controlled trials is also linked to power and exclusion. It is linked to economic power, for example, of pharmaceutical companies, and is also linked to epistemic power in that, for example, the evidence that counts in EBM usually excludes qualitative data such as patients' narratives or also cultural and structural determinants of health. So maybe more broadly, how do we think intersecting economic and epistemic power relations together with this argument about the democratization of knowledge through EBM?
Mm-hmm. Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for this very important question. I think for my research participants, it was very important to think about their agency and an ability to follow the clinical guidelines, while at the same time adjusting and personalizing them for the needs of the patients that they face. I think this is one of the values of EBM that they articulated rather prominently, is this ability to include patients in the whole stage of decision making and in learning how to be transparent with the patients and how to explain to them what's going to happen in the current situation. So
Mariia Denisova, the time appointment for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Mariia Denisova, the degree committee here presented has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Horsman is authorized to confer upon this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Mariia Denisova, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Here it is.
Thank you. So, dear Masha, congratulations. Today you passed the last formal academic exam and received a doctor's degree for your thesis on the position of private clinics in Russia. As it became clear from the discussions, you did a good work and a very interesting study, which is an interesting contribution to the fields of science and technology studies, informality studies, and Russia studies. This is also a good moment to look back and reflect on the past years. In the context of a Marie Curie network market, we had 2 PhD vacancies for a study of informality and healthcare in Russia. One focusing on pharmacy, the other on private healthcare provision. And we added a science and technology studies twist to the requirements, as that is who we are, in a way. You applied, and in the first online conversation we had, Olga and I, it was immediately clear to us that you were a very good candidate. Not only because your educational background with a master in sociology and anthropology, but also because you were already involved in publishing an article and were clearly intellectually engaged with academic life and academic discussions. You are a reflexive mind. You could relate very well to the vacancy and immediately showed a kind of ownership in how you told us why this was an interesting theme and which conceptual and methodological opportunities you saw. You were already familiar with the science and technology studies literature and liked to continue that line further in studying practices of private clinics in Russia. You shared your journey from the start with Olga, little Olga. This is big Olga. Who will defend her thesis later this year and who is paranymph now. When we spoke to Olga, we had a similar experience. Also a very good candidate with ideas of her own. And when we appointed you, the 2 themes were divided between the 2 of you in a rather natural way. Olga would focus on how patients in Russia played an important role in getting access to healthcare and drugs, and you would focus on private clinics in Russia. You both moved to Maastricht, started to study, and were enrolled in the PhD, the National PhD Training Program, Science, Technology, and Modern Culture. Marie Curie offers 3-year PhDs, and although that is a very short time, you came quite far, especially considering the difficult circumstances of the work. After the start of the PhD, you began negotiating access to your field, private clinics, which in Russia is not an easy task. very independently, without our help, but with some assistance of, as I remember well, a father of a classmate. So much for informal practices. You were able to get the directors and doctors talking to you and convince them to collaborate with you during the study. However, when the fieldwork had just only started, the COVID pandemic had changed the world. Your field became inaccessible and you had to turn to digital methods to stay in touch with your field. And when COVID was more or less under control and pandemic control measures were lifted, Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war. Relations with Russia were blocked, and again, your field was inaccessible. And you had to be creative to continue the study by very different means than we had in mind from the start. Apart from the enormous impact on your study, these developments also had enormous personal impact. Already during COVID, contact with your family was hindered, and since the start of the war with Ukraine, this has been the case even more. The war led to quite complicated emotions and feelings of sometimes, say, depression, anxiety, guilt, and anger about the country where you were born and raised. I remember that afternoon that it became clear that the large-scale Russian invasion was a fact, the 24th of February 2022, the four of us, little and big Olga, and we went to the Brandweer canteen and drank whiskey, Irish coffee, and wine, trying to find out how to relate to what happened. And soon after the first Ukrainian refugees arrived in Maastricht, you and Olga both started to do volunteering and translating work to help, to do something and not to feel powerless. Doing a PhD can be one of the most intellectually fascinating and fulfilling periods in the life of an academic, as a person can dedicate her or himself completely to learning, writing, and reading. For you, it was an extremely challenging time, professionally and personally, and I respect and admire how you dealt with these challenges. On the bright side, when settling in Maastricht, you learned to ride a bicycle. You found yourself a real Limburg sweetheart, Sebastian, and a lovely cat. And when two PhDs are participating in the same larger project, you never know how it will develop. You and Olga did not know each other from the start, or not from Russia at least, but it appeared that although you are very different persons, you work together amazingly well. We always had meetings with the four of us, and you never interfered in each other's work or got into a kind of competing modus. You were always helping each other while providing each other space. It was a little difficult for you to get the first article published, and you had very disappointing experiences with some editors, while Olga had immediately success. But these dynamics never stood between the two of you. You both were very mature in handling these difficulties and the difficulties you encountered during this PhD and in shaping a social context for the PhD work in our small team. You are the first to defend, Olga will follow soon. You were in a hurry. You wanted to move on to new intellectual horizons. And here we are. It's done, and it's done very well. It's not a surprise that you are very much into an academic career. This is clear from the way you expanded your work beyond the thesis by becoming a member of the International Cancer Anthropology Network, with whom you wrote an article about the political stakes of cancer epistemics that was published last year in Social Science and Medicine, but is not even part of the thesis. I'm very happy that you were selected for a postdoc position in Tilburg in a research project on artificial intelligence in healthcare, supervised by Professor Antoinette de Bond. Interestingly, she did her PhD with me in 2000, 25 years ago. So I think she will be very happy with you as a researcher, and you will find a really good place to continue your academic life in a new direction. But however, first enjoy this day, celebrate the PhD, take a breath, a relaxing holiday. Congratulations of both Olga and me. It was a pleasure working with you.
Dear Dr. Denisova, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. You studied an important and interesting topic, and you did a great job at Maastricht University. You will leave our university now, but I hope your further academic career will be successful in Tilburg or elsewhere.
Thank you.
Now I close this session. The committee will now take a photograph at the stairs outside this aula, and there will be a reception here in the building, so the audience can go there and wait for Masha.
You can leave the books here.